So today we're presenting on rule number 7 for Ignatius of Loyola's Rules of Discernment. And to be honest, out of all the rules of discernment, this is probably the one that I struggle with the most, just as it's seemingly very counterintuitive. Whereas a lot of the other rules, they kind of really are like, you hear them and you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. This is one that we kind of have to chew on and ingest a little bit. And so this may be one where you kind of just gotta grind through a little bit of the content. Now, I'm not going to lie, because this rule is so incredibly confusing for me personally, I actually recruited some help in preparing this from Father Timothy Gallagher. He has a wonderful Discernment of Spirits series, and in it he actually does a magnificent job illuminating some of the teachings for Rule 7. So some of the stuff that you'll hear today, I just flat out took from his text. So I will give 100% credit to Father Gallagher on this. The guy is a genius and a spiritual master. So here is rule number 7 in its fullness. Rule 7 states, "Let one who is in desolation consider how the Lord has left him in trial in his natural powers, so that he may resist the various agitations and temptations of the enemy. Since he can resist with the divine help, which always remains with him, though he does not clearly feel it. For the Lord has taken away from him his great fervor, abundant love, and intense grace, leaving him, however, sufficient grace for eternal salvation." Now, the whole premise of this of let one who is in desolation consider how the Lord has left them in this trial. It just seems pretty intense, right? Because we pray in the Our Father, right? Lead us not into temptation. But this is something that Ignatius had experienced in his own life, where just like you would, if a child, right, is trying to grow in particular virtues, at some point you're teaching them how to ride a bike. At some point you're going to have to take the training wheels off and then just let them go. Or at some point you're going to need to let them go to their friend's house and you can't walk them there. They got to get there all by themselves. And these moments are hard, but they're also part of the soul growing and developing, just like the person is growing and developing. And so there are times where the Lord will kind of remove the training wheels and will allow us to experience desolation, so that when we're in the midst of desolation, we can actually learn quite a few things. When this rule is dissected, it gives us 3 things to ponder in regards to spiritual desolation. So here are the 3 things. 1, desolation is a trial that is permitted by the Lord. Permitted is the key word, not caused. 2, one is to consider the nature of desolation. Okay? 3, one is to consider the divine purpose in God allowing this trial to occur. Thus, for the rest of this lesson, we're going to basically kind of touch those 3 aspects and kind of dissect those and open them up. Desolation being a trial permitted by the Lord. Now, recognizing that desolation is simply just a trial, rather than a permanent reality, is important for the person in desolation. Because often when the soul is struck with desolation, they view it as a permanent disposition and they lose all hope of the future. It's like, this is just what life's going to be like for the rest of time. Now, seeing desolation as a trial also brings us to a spiritual awakening. God trusts me enough to allow this experience to befall me. This must mean that I have enough of His grace to fight with my will and my mind against the evil one's advances. So I know this sounds strange, right? Like when we're in desolation, we really don't want to say like, this is great. But part of what's actually really good about it is we realize the Lord trusts us enough. Is He's kind of allowing us to go through this trial to kind of flex the muscles that we've gained in the spiritual life. God would not place us in this trial or allow us this trial if it was impossible to overcome with His grace. Thus, considering as St. Ignatius suggests in rule number 7, the state of desolation, we actually gain an increase of hope just by gaining perspective. By simply engaging the use of our reason and considering the current state as just something temporary, we are given a lot of strength and hope. Now, here's an analogy that maybe you've experienced in your life. Have you ever felt sick, all right, not COVID sick, but like just felt sick, just normal sickness, right? And you're like, oh man, I've waited a couple days, it's not clearing up. And so you make an appointment, you go to the doctor, and you go to the doctor and they're like, oh, okay, you actually have pneumonia. Now you haven't at this point taken any like medications, it's still, you're not feeling great, it's not like it's broken, but just having the knowledge of your diagnosis actually makes you feel better. But we as human beings, right, we don't know why things are going on, and if we can't figure it out, there's actually a suffering to this. If you've ever talked with someone who's been sick for a long time, but they can't get a medical diagnosis, that's almost just as painful as the sickness itself. So the same thing true now with desolation is as soon as we realize, okay, yep, I'm in desolation and the Lord is allowing this, there's just a peace that comes over the soul. Now, personally, I cannot even tell you how many times this has happened in my own life where I've kind of had my eyes opened and I'm like, okay, I can handle this. Now, since I've begun doing kind of the research around the spiritual exercise and things like this, there have been times where I've experienced just a lot of spiritual warfare, just kind of a weird intensity. And maybe it's the whole fact that the whole world's turned upside down now. But in all reality, there's been just, it seems almost disproportionate amount of trials. And so as I'm going through it, I'll be like, this is terrible. What's going on? What am I doing wrong? And then this like aha moment will come and it's like, oh my goodness, like I'm in desolation now. And the Lord is allowing it for the purpose that I'll understand these rules and can start to apply them. So that when I teach them, I'm actually speaking out of conviction rather than just kind of teaching this fairy tale nonsense. And so I see now, because of this, that the purpose behind the desolation, and it makes it a lot easier to endure. Secondly, we are to consider the nature of the trial. Now, this is a very strange aspect of the rule. It's exhorting us to look, how exactly am I suffering or feeling in this spout of desolation? Once again, this rule strikes me personally as counterintuitive. To focus so much on desolation that it almost gives it more power. But what Ignatius of Loyola is doing is kind of what he was doing on rule number 6 about examination. Ignatius of Loyola is all about examining oneself. He would have this kind of drive that he would teach all the young Jesuits how to do the exam in prayer. And it's basically how to walk through your day with God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and to see how God is working. So just as he said in Rule 6 that one of the ways to break desolation is examination, so too he says when you find yourself in desolation, it's good to kind of see what is the nature of why I'm in this state. Now, going back to Father Timothy Gallagher in his book, Discernment of Spirits, he gives this fascinating example from the life of a blessed Angela of Foligno. He says, he recounts Blessed Angela's words from her diary. She writes in her diary, that she felt that the Lord was taken away, that all fervor, abundant love, and intense graces were now gone and inaccessible. She is able to recognize in analyzing her desolation exactly where she is being attacked. God is absent, and I don't know where he's to be found. Now, Father Gallagher then goes on to say that desolation can affect 4 areas of the person. Okay, how we think, the mind. How we choose things, make us lethargic, so the will, all right? The ability to recollect in the memory. And envision spiritual realities in an erroneous way. So that's kind of like our imagination, right? Is desolation will affect how we imagine all the possibilities of the future. Thus, all the faculties of the soul are pretty much attacked by this. And this is where it can be really disorienting, but if we can kind of narrow in to say, okay, what part of me is being attacked? Is it my imagination? Is it my memory? Is it how I'm thinking? Is it my lethargy in the will? It can again give us some information that will help us to move through the desolation. And recognizing what faculty is most affected, the person can actually implore the exact opposite of that faculty. So here's an example, right? Let's say I locate the desolation in my memory. Like I can't remember any time that the Lord was good to me. Well, what's going to be important then in these moments is to actually have either journals or a spiritual friend, or just to be like radically honest, to like walk back in the past and say, no, I'm going to put down on paper and I'm going to say out loud, here are the ways that I've experienced the Lord in the past. Now, this could be so intense, right, that St. Therese of Lisieux, when experiencing this real desolation, or as they would call in the spiritual tradition, darkness, toward the end of her life, she actually pricked her finger and wrote the creed that we profess on Sundays in her own blood. Because she was having such a hard time believing these truths. She knew them to be true, but she couldn't access her memory. And so she's just giving herself that external sign. This is real. And I am going to show it with the very life that is within me. Now, this is why journaling, I know journaling can be painful for some people. Some people love it. Other people are like, you couldn't pay me to journal. Or like they'll get a brand new journal, they're going to start, and then it's like, dear journal, one day, and then you're done. But this is where journaling actually helps the soul in unbelievable ways. Because it's literally like this external memory that we can go back to when our internal one isn't working so great. Now, the third element to reflect upon in the purpose behind the trial of desolation is what St. Ignatius says in his seventh rule like this. Let one who is in desolation consider how the Lord has left him in trial in his natural powers, so that he may resist the various agitations and temptations of the enemy. Now, St. Ignatius then tells the directees that they are to find a purpose in God allowing the desolation. So we kind of touched on this a little bit, but here's a little deeper level. As it gives one an understanding of why the Lord would allow suffering, because he can bring forth fruitfulness, right? Now, the Gospels are littered with examples of how God will allow suffering, sort of either natural or spiritual desolation, solely to pull out from it actual fruit in conversion. So you have the Samaritan woman in John 4 that Christ is speaking with at the well, and the woman's really suffering a lot, going through a lot of pain and turmoil, and even as Christ is asking her questions about her past relationships of her several husbands, that's painful for the woman to recount these things. But as she does, and she's engaging the memory, she's realizing, oh my goodness, all this suffering, it was worth this point where I'm going to encounter the Lord and my life is going to change. We have Jesus, right? In the gospel, this is John chapter 11, where he hears that his friend Lazarus is sick, and he doesn't go and heal him. He waits 4 days until he's dead and been buried. And then he goes and sees him. So again, God allows the pain because he can bring something more from it. Then we have Jesus dying on the cross because the Father's going to resurrect him 3 days later. Then you have in the Acts of the Apostles, St. Peter being locked in prison on several occasions solely so that God could let him out and show that he had power over even the locked areas of our life. And then you have St. Paul, who was given a thorn in the flesh. And St. Paul, reflecting on this, says he was given this thorn in the flesh because God's power would be made perfect in weakness. Now, all these examples show forth that God allows, he doesn't cause, he allows suffering so that even greater good can come forth. By comprehending this, it allows us greater strength, both to persevere through our current desolation, but also to persevere through future desolations. See, we are serving a God who allows difficulties because he can bring forth benefit. This exercise of seeing purpose behind desolation is actually one of the things that allows us to persevere in the midst of difficulty. This is where, a student or someone who's trying to get in shape, all these people, right, they say, okay, I know the end goal and it's worth the sacrifice that I'm going to endure. Without this step, Rule 7, we just simply live unintentional and accidental lives, going from one feeling to the next, see no purpose or direction in our lives. Much like how children live in kind of like that extreme of one thing to the next, they're not really they don't have like the long-term perspective. In fact, in psychology, they'll talk about object permanence, where as kids are developing, they have to know that just because something is put away or a person leaves doesn't mean that it's gone forever or that the person is dead. and we learn this as we grow, right? Is just because something is hard right now or something is absent, it doesn't mean that it's forever. It's just for now. By seeing purpose behind what's occurring, we can persevere through a lot. Now, Rule 7 is all about growing in spiritual maturity. It is interesting that when we are experiencing spiritual consolation, we feel like we can do anything with God. And then when we're in spiritual desolation, we feel like we can do nothing, often to want to give up. It is because when we feel good about serving God, right, we're kind of like this, almost like a mercenary. Ignatius will talk about this, where desolation is actually a gift in that it helps us to purify why we are serving and what we are doing in our mission of Christianity. Desolation makes us say, no, I'm doing this because it's right, not because I get the ooey gooeys when I'm doing it. Now, just to give a personal story about this, on my 30-day retreat in 2007, my retreat director, Father Mark Toops, he was giving me advice surrounding Rule 7. And I was in very, very thick desolation, and I was in this really thick darkness, and it was probably about halfway through the retreat, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm so selfish. Like, taking 30 days away from the world, 30 days of silence, like, who am I? I'm like this 22-year-old kid, and I'm getting this incredible experience that people wait their entire lives to. And it was given to me as a gift, like, I don't deserve this. And like, just all these desolate feelings and thoughts were coming forward, and it just made me feel very far from the Lord. And Father Mark Toops pulled out this quip. And now, up to this point, I had never heard this before. I've heard it a lot since, but for me, it was always brought to me by this priest. And he goes, hey, Nate, I need you to slow down, and I need you to remember something. And I want you to write this in your journal. I can't, he can, he promised. And I was like, okay, yeah, thanks. I'm suffering here. And that's what you give me as this little hallmark quip. But I had written it down in my journal. And so the next holy hour I went and I started to meditate and pray. I can't, he can, he promised. And it was like this kind of awakening came where I'm like, oh my goodness, like, I'm on this retreat because the Lord wanted it. And he organized it. Yeah, I feel like I'm spoiled beyond all telling to have it. But the Lord kind of cleared the threshing floor so that I could come. And he can do things in this, even if I'm too immature. And he has made this promise to me that he wants me as his son, and he's going to use this time for powerful things, even if I don't feel worthy of it. As I realized, right, that God had called me on this, it broke the desolation, I realized the purpose, right? If we actually acknowledge the truth, right? If we're feeling far from God or feeling hardships and we say, I can't, he can, he promised. That last line of he promised, it helps to put perspective, again, that this is just temporary. Part of the tragedy of desolation is that by its very nature, it clogs our memory. And we can't recall how much God actually loves us and desires us and is actively trying to pursue us. Trial has this element to it. Where often when I'm walking with a family who's going through a hard time, the trial or the discouragement or the desolation, whether that's natural or spiritual, it makes them forget all the other good times in life. And this happens so often in our lives where we're going through a present trial and it's like we can't recall anything good that ever happened in our life. Desolation should not have that power over us, and it won't if we're willing to fight against it. I can't. He can. He promised. The movement, though, from I can't to he can, it's not easy, right? And I'm not going to pretend it is. It takes a huge act of the will. And in fact, St. Teresa of Avila, in her own autobiography, she wrote, I feel like all the favors of the Lord that were granted to me have been forgotten. There remained only a memory to cause pain of what she used to have but didn't have now. and it's like everything in the past was just a dream. This is how desolation can affect the memory, and it's amazing, right? Because this can discourage us if we don't turn immediately to God. To say, yes, Lord, my way is dark, but one step enough for me, as Cardinal Newman would beautifully say. It has happened to so many saints throughout the tradition that they have forgotten God's goodness in the midst of trial. And if us who are not yet saints, just kind of people on the way, how common of an experience this will probably be for us, where we will experience times where we cannot remember the Lord has been good, even though he really has been in incredible ways. This is again where I really would encourage the activity of journaling. To journal in the good times and the bad. Even to make a note simply to say, I really felt blessed by the Lord today. Everything went fine, period. 3 sentences, that's it. It's enough that when the desolation hits and you look back, that you have something to see and to kind of weigh it against. So that is rule 7. As we start to move into the next rules, it gets very, very interesting. So stay tuned. God bless.